The lobby of Hamilton & Co., one of the most powerful corporate headquarters in the city, was filled with the usual rhythm of a busy weekday morning. Phones rang in the distance, heels clicked across polished marble floors, and conversations echoed softly as employees hurried toward elevators, balancing coffee cups and laptops. It was a place that represented wealth, success, and status. The glass walls gleamed in the sunlight, showing the city skyline like a crown of power. To the employees working there, stepping into this building felt like stepping into another world, a world where everyone was judged by their titles, their clothes, their cars, and even the way they spoke. Amid all that perfection, there was one figure who hardly got noticed: the janitor. His name was Mr. Alvarez. Every morning before the executives arrived, he quietly pushed his cleaning cart across the same lobby. He mopped the floors, polished the chrome handles, and wiped away fingerprints from the glass doors. He wore the same faded blue uniform each day, and his shoes were slightly worn out from the endless hours of walking back and forth. He kept his head down most of the time, not because he lacked confidence, but because he understood the invisible line that separated people in this place. He was the man with the mop, not the man in the suit. Most employees passed by him without a second look. A few nodded politely, but most were too busy scrolling through emails on their phones to notice him. For years, Mr. Alvarez had accepted this role quietly. He wasn't bitter, and he wasn't angry. He carried out his work with dignity. Yet, there was always something thoughtful in his eyes, as if he was silently watching and learning from the environment around him. That morning, however, things didn't go as usual. The CEO himself, Mr. Hamilton, happened to arrive earlier than expected. Mr. Hamilton was known throughout the business world as a sharp, powerful leader. He had built his empire from the ground up, and people admired him, but they also feared him. He had a reputation for his fiery temper and blunt words. Employees often straightened their posture when he walked by, nervous about being noticed for the wrong reason. As he entered the lobby, his sharp eyes scanned the area. He spotted Mr. Alvarez standing by the glass entrance, wiping a smudge with a cloth. For reasons no one fully understood, the CEO stopped in his tracks. His expression tightened, and his voice rose suddenly, echoing across the lobby. "You don't belong here," he shouted. The words pierced the quiet hum of the morning. Every conversation stopped. The clinking of cups, the tapping of keyboards, the shuffle of footsteps, everything froze. A handful of employees near the reception desk turned their heads in shock. No one had ever seen the CEO speak directly to the janitor before. Mr. Alvarez slowly lowered his cloth and turned to face the powerful man. His posture was calm, but his silence was heavy, like the pause before a storm. Employees held their breath, waiting for him to react. Normally, a person in his position might have looked down, mumbled an apology, or even stepped aside to avoid further attention. Everyone expected the same. But instead, Mr. Alvarez did something no one could have predicted. He straightened his shoulders, looked the CEO directly in the eyes, and with a voice steady and gentle, he replied, "I'm here for my daughter." For a moment, the room seemed to stop breathing. The words were not loud, yet they carried weight. The janitor had spoken with a kind of quiet courage that didn't require shouting. His voice wasn't sharp, but it was powerful because it was honest. The CEO blinked, thrown off guard. He had expected silence or maybe a quick excuse. But this answer was different. Around them, employees exchanged puzzled looks. Who was his daughter? Why would a janitor mention her in a place like this? The atmosphere in the lobby changed instantly. What had started as a humiliating confrontation began to feel like the start of something deeper. People's curiosity was sparked. The janitor, who had blended into the background for so long, suddenly stood in the center of everyone's attention. The CEO's face was unreadable for a second. His pride had been challenged, but not in the way he anticipated. There was no disrespect in the janitor's tone, only a calm statement of truth. Yet that truth carried a mystery, one that demanded to be understood. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. A young receptionist, who had always greeted the janitor with a smile in the mornings, felt a lump in her throat. She had never thought about his personal life before. She realized that while she rushed through her day worrying about deadlines and emails, this man carried stories and struggles she had never considered. In the far corner, two interns whispered to each other. "What does he mean?" "His daughter works here," one asked. The other shrugged, eyes wide with surprise. The CEO cleared his throat, visibly unsettled, but he didn't respond right away. He simply narrowed his eyes, as though searching for answers in the janitor's calm gaze. Employees expected him to snap back with another harsh remark, but instead, he hesitated. That hesitation was rare. For Mr. Alvarez, the moment felt both heavy and liberating. For years, he had walked through this building invisible, a shadow among shining glass and polished shoes. But at that moment, he was seen not just as a janitor, but as a man, a father, someone with a purpose larger than the mop in his hand. The lobby remained still, every employee caught between curiosity and admiration. They sensed that something meaningful had just begun, something that would ripple far beyond a simple outburst. None of them could predict what would come next, but all of them knew this was not an ordinary morning. It was the moment when the quietest man in the building finally spoke, and his words carried more power than the CEO's yell. The lobby still carried the echo of the janitor's words, "I'm here for my daughter." Employees who had been walking past earlier had now stopped near the reception, pretending to shuffle papers or check their phones, but their eyes kept darting toward the two men standing face to face. The moment had shaken the calm rhythm of the morning. The janitor's voice had not been loud, but it had been steady. It was the kind of voice that carried truth, a voice that didn't need force to make people listen. Those words seemed to settle into the walls of the building, refusing to fade. Mr. Hamilton, the CEO, stood frozen for a heartbeat. His reputation as a commanding man came from always having the last word, always controlling the conversation, and always being the one people feared. But the answer he received was not one he expected. It was too honest to dismiss and too mysterious to ignore. His sharp eyes studied the janitor, but for once he found himself speechless. The silence stretched until it felt heavy on everyone's shoulders. An assistant coughed quietly, as if trying to break the tension. One of the security guards shifted uncomfortably. The receptionist's fingers hovered above her keyboard, but she didn't type a word. All of them were waiting, watching, almost afraid to move in case they missed what might happen next. Mr. Alvarez, however, stood calmly. He did not look angry. He did not look embarrassed. His face carried the same quiet dignity it always did when he polished the floors or emptied trash bins. But behind his eyes, there was something new, something unshakable. The CEO finally spoke, his tone low but sharp, "Your daughter." He said it not with curiosity, but with disbelief, as if the idea itself did not make sense to him. "What do you mean you're here for your daughter?" Mr. Alvarez didn't hesitate. "She works here," he replied simply, his words direct and without hesitation. A murmur ran through the lobby. The employees exchanged glances, trying to recall if they had ever noticed someone with the janitor's last name in the company directory. Some of them had seen a young intern moving around different departments, quietly doing her work without much fuss. Could that be his daughter? The idea unsettled many. It meant that the janitor, who most of them barely noticed, was connected to someone among them. The CEO raised his eyebrows. His voice grew colder, though not as loud as before. "And what does that have to do with you being here? This is not a place for family visits." Still calm, Mr. Alvarez answered, "I'm not here as a visitor. I'm here to work, the same as you. But I work so my daughter can be here too." I want her to have the opportunities one never had." The words, once again, were spoken with no anger. They were not meant to challenge or insult. They were simply the truth. And that truth carried a weight heavier than any lecture. The CEO felt his jaw tighten. In his world, success was measured by degrees, by luxury, by how high one could climb. He was used to seeing people fight for positions, used to people wanting recognition, wanting status. But here was a man who worked in the shadows, not for himself but for someone else. It was a reason that didn't fit neatly into the CEO's world of status and power. Employees nearby could feel the shift in the air. It was not just a confrontation anymore. It was a moment that made them reflect on themselves. They thought of their own families, their parents, and the sacrifices that had been made quietly, without applause, just so they could stand where they were now. The young receptionist, who had been watching closely, felt her throat tighten. She remembered her own father driving long hours at night just to pay for her college books. She suddenly saw the janitor not as a man with a mop, but as a father carrying the same kind of devotion. The CEO, however, was not ready to admit defeat. His pride was too strong. "You're saying you belong here because of her?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Mr. Alvarez's reply was gentle but firm. "I belong here because I earn my place every day. I clean, I fix, I take care of this building so others can do their work in it. And yes, I belong here because I want my daughter to see that dignity is not in the title, but in the effort. If she works hard in her studies, if she learns, then one day she can belong here in a way that goes beyond my uniform." The murmur among the employees grew louder. Some of them lowered their eyes, feeling a wave of humility. The janitor's words were not just for the CEO. They were for everyone who had ever judged worth by the cut of a suit or the number on a paycheck. Mr. Hamilton, for the first time in many years, didn't have a quick response. His sharp tongue seemed tied. He looked at the janitor, and for a second, he saw not the blue uniform, not the mop, not the quiet man who walked the halls. He saw a father. He saw sacrifice. He saw something that reminded him of his own beginnings back when he was young, when he worked late nights to pay his own tuition before fortune favored him. The memory unsettled him because he had buried that part of himself long ago. Still, his pride kept him from showing it. He gave a small shake of his head, turned sharply, and walked toward the private elevator. The echo of his footsteps filled the silence. Everyone watched as the doors closed behind him. Only then did people begin to move again. Conversations started in hushed tones. Some employees pretended to be busy but stole glances at Mr. Alvarez. He quietly picked up his cloth again and returned to wiping the glass, as though nothing had happened. But to the people around him, everything had changed. The receptionist typed slowly, distracted by the scene replaying in her mind. Two interns whispered excitedly, "Can you believe that?" He stood up to him. One of the managers who had been rushing earlier now paused by the coffee machine, lost in thought about his own father's sacrifices. The janitor, though, did not look for attention. He went back to his duties, steady and unbothered. Yet his simple words continued to echo in the minds of everyone who had heard them, "I'm here for my daughter." The next few days at Hamilton & Co. felt different. The scene in the lobby, though no one dared to discuss it openly in front of the CEO, had become the quiet topic in break rooms and whispered conversations in the cafeteria. Everyone who had been there retold the moment when the janitor, Mr. Alvarez, calmly answered the CEO with, "I'm here for my daughter." Some told it with awe, some with disbelief, but no one could deny the impact it had left on them. The janitor himself, however, carried on with his work just as he always had. He arrived early, polished the marble floors, dusted the stair rails, and emptied bins. His movements were steady and careful, as though he had been born for the work. But while others now looked at him differently, he did not carry himself with pride or boastfulness. He remained the same quiet figure who preferred to let his work speak for him. For the first time, however, employees noticed his daughter. Her name was Sophia. She was an intern in the marketing department, a young woman with bright eyes and a humble nature. She often sat quietly in meetings, taking notes diligently, rarely speaking unless asked. Many had seen her before but hadn't paid attention. Now, every glance carried new curiosity. Some whispered, "That's the janitor's daughter." Others said, "She must be very smart to get into this internship." A few even felt guilty for not noticing her earlier. Sophia, however, was aware of none of this. She focused on her tasks, determined to prove herself. She stayed late to finish reports, asked thoughtful questions when given the chance, and never once used her father's presence in the building to draw sympathy or attention. To her, her father was not just the man who cleaned the halls. He was the reason she was there at all. Years ago, when their family business had failed, life had changed drastically for the Alvarez family. Once, her father had owned a small repair shop. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. He had built it with his own two hands, fixing appliances for neighbors and customers who trusted him. But when larger companies expanded into their neighborhood, business slowed. Bills piled up, and eventually, the shop closed. For a short time, the family struggled. There were nights when Sophia heard her parents whispering at the kitchen table about overdue payments. She remembered her father's tired eyes but also his determination never to let his children feel ashamed. He never allowed despair to stay in their home. When the janitor job opened at Hamilton & Co., Mr. Alvarez took it without hesitation. It wasn't what he had dreamed of, but it was steady. He traded the smell of sawdust and tools for cleaning supplies and mops. He never complained. Instead, he told his children, "Work is work. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as you do it with honesty and heart." Sophia grew up carrying those words inside her. When she was accepted into the internship program at Hamilton & Co., her father's eyes shone with pride. "This is your chance," he told her. "I will do what I must to make sure you finish what you start." And so, while she learned the language of business in meeting rooms upstairs, he quietly cleaned the same building downstairs. The irony was not lost on her, but she never saw it as shameful. Instead, she saw it as a reminder of how far sacrifice could carry someone. Every time she walked past the janitorial closet where her father kept his supplies, she felt a swell of motivation. Back in the lobby, the CEO could not erase the image of that morning. He had been certain of himself, certain of his place above others, yet the janitor's calm reply unsettled him. It replayed in his head during long meetings, in the silence of his office, even while he drove home in his expensive car. "I'm here for my daughter." The words stirred something in him he had long buried. Before he was a CEO, before the fame and the headlines, he had been just another young man struggling to make a place in the world. He remembered nights spent studying under dim lights, working extra shifts to pay tuition. He remembered the sacrifices his own parents had made, his mother working 2 jobs, his father selling his treasured possessions so their son could go to school. Somewhere along the journey of wealth and success, he had stopped thinking about those things. Now, a janitor's words had dragged those memories back to the surface. Meanwhile, Sophia's dedication began to show. Her reports were clear, her ideas creative, and her respect toward others noticeable. Managers started appreciating her work, though they did not yet connect her directly to the janitor everyone was whispering about. She, too, had begun to feel the whispers in the hallways, but she kept her focus. She wanted her work to define her, not her last name or her father's job. One evening, as the offices grew quiet and most employees had left, Sophia stayed behind finishing a project. When she finally packed her things and stepped out, she saw her father in the lobby, mopping the last stretch of marble floor. He looked up, smiled, and waved. She walked toward him, and for a moment they stood together in the near-empty building. "You should go home, Papa," she said gently. He chuckled softly. "I could say the same to you." They laughed quietly, and for a moment the lobby, which had been a place of tension days ago, felt warm. She reached out and squeezed his hand. "One day, I'll make you proud." "You already have," he answered. "Every day." What neither of them noticed was that someone else was watching from the balcony above the CEO. He had come down late from a meeting and paused when he saw the two together. He leaned on the railing, unseen, and observed the tender exchange between father and daughter. Something inside him stirred again. The picture was clear: a man who worked with his hands so his daughter could rise higher than he had. It reminded him too much of his own beginnings. As he walked away, the CEO's expression was unreadable. But deep down, he felt a shift. He could no longer dismiss the janitor as just a man with a mop. He was a man with a purpose, a man whose sacrifices spoke louder than wealth. The story of the janitor and his daughter continued to ripple quietly through the company. No one knew where it would lead, but everyone sensed it was not over yet. The building had seen many business deals, many power struggles, but never had it witnessed something so simple and yet so profound. And through it all, Mr. Alvarez remained the same, steady, humble, and filled with a quiet strength that no uniform could hide. The days passed, but the CEO could not free his mind from the memory of the janitor's calm reply. In all his years of building the company, he had faced rivals, critics, and board members who challenged his decisions. He had heard complaints, arguments, and even praises that felt empty. Yet the quiet words of a janitor, "I'm here for my daughter," lingered inside him longer than anything else. At first, he tried to brush it off. He buried himself in reports, in financial plans, in high-profile meetings. He told himself it was foolish to waste time thinking about one small moment in the lobby. But the more he tried to push it away, the stronger it returned. Whenever he looked at the shining marble floors or the polished glass walls, he remembered the man who cared for them. And behind that memory was the thought of a father's love, one so steady that even the loudest voice in the building could not silence it. The CEO began noticing things he had ignored before. He saw how Mr. Alvarez worked quietly in the background, never rushing, never complaining, always thorough. He saw how the man greeted everyone with the same polite nod, no matter their title. He noticed how other employees, after that day, had begun treating the janitor with more respect, some smiling at him in the morning, some stepping aside to let him pass, some even thanking him. It was as if the entire building had shifted, little by little, because of one moment of courage. But the change that shook him most came when he finally noticed Sophia. He had sat in a meeting one afternoon, half distracted, when one of the managers presented a marketing plan. The young intern at the end of the table had contributed a few notes on customer behavior, and her ideas were surprisingly sharp. She didn't speak loudly, but when she spoke, people listened. Her eyes held the same quiet determination he had seen in her father. It was only later, when he overheard her last name, that he realized who she was. The discovery unsettled him even more. Here was the daughter of the man he had dismissed, working in his company with dignity and intelligence. She carried no sign of shame. She did not try to hide her connection. She simply worked, with the same quiet discipline her father showed. That evening, when the CEO sat in his private office, the city lights glowing outside his window, he found himself remembering his own father. His father had been a factory worker, strong in spirit but always tired from long shifts. As a boy, he had watched his father come home with sore hands and weary eyes, yet never once complain. He had seen his mother patch clothes, save coins, and sacrifice her own dreams so he could chase his. Back then, he had promised himself he would rise high enough to give them a better life. And he did. He rose higher than he ever imagined. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten what sacrifice looked like. He had stopped seeing dignity in the humble and instead built walls of pride around himself. The memory made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. The next morning, when he walked through the lobby, he found his eyes searching for the janitor. Mr. Alvarez was there, as always, wiping down the railings with slow, steady movements. The CEO's steps slowed for a moment, but he did not stop. He simply nodded once, almost without realizing it, before entering the elevator. A few employees noticed and exchanged glances. The CEO had never acknowledged the janitor before. Over the next week, the CEO continued to observe quietly. He saw how Sophia stayed late at her desk, determined to finish her projects. He saw how her father waited in the lobby until she was ready to go home, even if it meant staying longer. They never made a show of it, but their bond was clear. One worked to build a future, and the other worked to support that future. Inside, the CEO felt something he hadn't felt in years: shame. Not the shame of failure, but the shame of forgetting where he came from. He realized that his empire, his wealth, and his title meant little if he had lost touch with the values that carried him there. One afternoon, during a board meeting, as executives argued about profit margins and strategies, the CEO found himself distracted. His mind wandered back to the janitor's words. For the first time in years, he questioned the culture of his company. Was it truly a place of opportunity, or had it become a place of pride and division? He looked around the polished table at men and women in fine suits and wondered if any of them remembered the struggles of those who came before them. That evening, he sat alone in his office long after everyone else had left. The building was quiet, the kind of silence that made the hum of the air conditioning sound louder. He stood by the window, staring at the city lights. He thought of his father's rough hands, of his mother's careful savings, of the sacrifices that had lifted him to this height. And then he thought of the janitor downstairs, working for his daughter with the same determination. He finally understood why the moment in the lobby had shaken him so deeply. It was because the janitor reminded him of himself, of who he once was before pride covered it. The next morning, he made a decision. He didn't announce it with fanfare, didn't call a press release. Quietly, he began speaking to his HR department about scholarships for employees' families. He suggested new training programs, internships, and opportunities for those who could not afford them otherwise. He didn't explain where the idea came from, but he knew the truth. Meanwhile, the employees continued to whisper about the change in their CEO. He seemed quieter, less harsh. He still demanded excellence, but there was a different tone in his words, almost as if he had remembered something important. As for Mr. Alvarez, he remained unchanged in his routine. He continued to mop the floors, polish the glass, and greet people with his polite nod. He didn't know that his simple words had shaken the highest office in the building. He didn't need to know. For him, it was enough to see his daughter walking proudly into her future. And yet, everyone around him began to realize that sometimes the strongest lessons do not come from the boardroom, but from the quietest corners of the building. Time moved on inside the tall glass building, but the memory of that single morning never faded. For some, it was just a story they had witnessed, but for others, it became something much deeper, something they carried with them as a reminder every time they walked through the polished lobby. The janitor, Mr. Alvarez, never changed his way of living. He still pushed his cart through the halls with the same quiet dignity. He still polished the rails until they shone and mopped the marble until it gleamed. To him, work was work. He had never cared about being noticed, and even after the whispers that spread through the company, he remained the same. Yet now, people looked at him differently. Employees who once passed him without a glance now greeted him. Some even stopped for small conversations, asking how he was, thanking him for his work. A few admitted quietly, "I respect you, Mr. Alvarez." Each time, he would simply smile and nod, never letting pride take hold. But it wasn't only the employees who had changed. The CEO, Mr. Hamilton, too, had begun to shift in ways few had expected. He still carried authority and sharpness, but he had grown quieter, more thoughtful. When he walked past the janitor, his eyes no longer held disdain. They carried something else, something closer to respect. What no one knew was how deeply the CEO had been shaken that day. He had built a life of power, thinking that success was measured only by titles, money, and control. But the janitor's reply had pierced through the walls of pride he had built around himself. Each time he remembered it, he thought of his own father's struggles, of the sacrifices that had once lifted him. The memory softened him in ways he did not show openly. It was during this time that Sophia, the janitor's daughter, began to rise. Her internship ended, but her work spoke for itself, and she was offered a permanent position. She accepted with humility and gratitude, determined to keep proving that she belonged not because of her father's sacrifice but because of her own effort. She worked long hours, prepared her reports with care, and often came up with creative solutions during team discussions. Colleagues admired her discipline. Some said quietly, "She reminds me of him, steady, patient, and strong." Others admitted she had something rare, the ability to stay humble while still aiming high. Every evening, her father waited for her in the lobby. It became a quiet routine no one dared to laugh at. The sight of the janitor standing patiently, leaning on his cart as his daughter finished her work, became something many employees looked forward to. It reminded them of the things that mattered most: family, love, sacrifice. One night, when Sophia finally stepped out after a long day, she saw her father sitting on a bench by the glass wall, gazing at the city lights. He looked tired, but his face was peaceful. She walked up to him, sat beside him, and said softly, "You don't have to wait every night, Papa. I can go home by myself." He smiled, shaking his head. "No, Mija. You walk up there with your head held high because you know I am down here. That is how it should be." She didn't argue. She simply leaned her head on his shoulder for a moment. The building was quiet around them, but inside that silence was a bond stronger than words. The CEO happened to pass through the lobby that night. He stopped for a brief moment when he saw them together. Something about the image struck him: the tired father waiting for his daughter, the daughter leaning on him with trust. It reminded him again of his own parents, of the nights when he too had leaned on their sacrifices. He walked away silently, carrying the picture in his heart. In the months that followed, the CEO quietly introduced more changes. Training programs were created for employees who wanted to learn new skills. Scholarships for children of staff became a regular offering. Opportunities were opened for people who otherwise would never have had a chance. He never announced the reason for these changes, but many guessed the truth. The culture of the company slowly transformed. People began to look at one another differently. They started to see not just titles but the human stories behind each face. They realized that every person in the building, from the executives to the janitors, carried a story of sacrifice and love. Sophia's career blossomed. She was promoted step by step, always working with humility. She never once used her father's story for advantage. She never asked for special treatment. Instead, she let her work prove her worth. And with every step forward, she carried her father's lessons: work is work. Do it with honesty and heart. Years later, she stood in the same lobby where everything had begun. She was no longer an intern, no longer a new employee. She was a manager now, with her own team and her own projects. She paused in the middle of the marble floor, remembering the day her father had stood tall before the CEO. She remembered the silence, the shock, the power of those simple words. Her father, older now but still working, walked toward her with his cart. She turned, smiled, and met him halfway. "Papa," she said softly, "I wish you would rest now. You've done more than enough." He chuckled gently. "I will rest when I know you are standing taller than me. Until then, I will walk these halls. Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled through them. She reached for his hand and squeezed it. Everything I am, Papa, is because of you. He looked at her with warmth and pride. And everything I am is because of you. A father becomes strong only when his children give him reason to be. The employees passing through the lobby paused for a moment, touched by the quiet exchange. They didn't need to hear the full story, they already knew it. It had become part of the company's history, passed down like a lesson. As for the CEO, he stood quietly in the distance, watching. He never repeated his words from that morning years ago. He never again said, "You don't belong here." Instead, in his heart, he carried the truth he had learned that day, that belonging has nothing to do with wealth or titles. It has everything to do with love, sacrifice, and dignity. And so, the legacy of that single moment lived on. A father had spoken not with anger, but with quiet courage. A daughter had risen because of his sacrifice. And a company had been reminded that the strongest lessons often come from the humblest people. In the end, Mr. Alvarez did belong there. He always had. Not because of the uniform he wore. Not because of the mop in his hands. But because of the love that gave strength to every step he took. And no voice, no pride, no empire in the world could ever erase that truth.